Once a business has worked out whether they have to provide country of origin information, they're going to have to figure out what type of claim they can make about their products. There are 4 basic claims: grown in, produced in, made in, and packed in. Given we've got an expert here, I'm going to defer to Tanya to talk about the first claim, grown in. Tanya, what does saying you grew something in a particular country really mean?
There's a fairly detailed definition, but I think practical examples are always helpful to cut through that legal jargon. Under the standard, a single ingredient food is grown in a particular country if it meets one of 3 tests. These are set out on the current slide and also on page 6 in the ACCC's Food Labelling Guide. Now, the first test covers things like a calf raised to an adult cow. The second test refers to foods like wheat or vegetables grown from a seed. And the third test covers foods that are harvested, extracted, or derived from things that satisfy the first test. For example, milk from a cow that was raised in that country. Generally, a food with more than one ingredient is also grown in a country if each of its significant ingredients was grown in that country and all, or virtually all, of its processing occurred there too.
Look, it's important here to note that this is only the general definition. If you're labelling a non-priority food or an imported food, you'll need to meet this definition to be able to use a grown-in claim. However, priority foods must meet a higher threshold to be able to use a grown in Australia kangaroo label. In that case, the food's content must be exclusively Australian in origin. It's not enough that the significant ingredients are Australian.
That's true. An example of this difference could be candied fruit versus snack-sized fruit cup. Candied fruit is a non-priority food because it's classed as confectionery. This food could be labelled grown in Australia as long as its significant ingredients, for example, the fruit and the sugar, were Australian grown. By contrast, the fruit cup is a priority food. For that product to carry the Grown in Australia kangaroo label, all of the ingredients, however minor, would have to be totally Australian.
Well, hopefully that's clear. Moving on to the second of the 4 possible options, we have the phrase produced in. The criteria for saying that something was produced in a country is very similar to saying it was grown there. Each of the food's significant ingredients must have been grown or otherwise wholly obtained in that country, and virtually all of its processing must have occurred there too. Sound familiar? Well, the main difference here between grown in and produced in is that produced in is a little bit broader because it includes food or ingredients that originate in a country but aren't technically grown, like water or salt.
Try and think about it from a consumer's perspective. Blueberries are grown while the blueberry sauce is produced or made. The standard is quite flexible for products that meet the criteria for a grown in or produced in claim, but it helps consumers if you use consistent wording.
Now, like with grown in Australia, there's a higher threshold for priority foods that want to be able to claim to be a quote-unquote product of Australia. For a food to carry a produced in Australia kangaroo label, its content has got to be exclusively Australian. So let's be clear, even if your priority food contains 99% Australian ingredients, it still can't be labelled as having been grown or produced in Australia. Under the new standard, if the percentage of Australian content is anything less than 100%, you must make a made-in claim instead. Well, for those of you thinking, that's all well and good, but what are you talking about when it comes to ingredients? We're going to be getting onto that subject later on. Chris, you've had a lot of experience dealing with Australian manufacturers, so I'm going to let you handle the third option, the made-in claim.
Oh, gee, thanks, Michael. As you've indicated, made in is going to be very important for a lot of Australian food manufacturers and producers. The rules around saying a priority food was produced in Australia are tighter now, so many foods that previously made a product of claim are going to fall into the made in category under the new standard. Bread, for example, baked with an imported food additive, will now be made in Australia, not product of Australia. First up, the important thing to recognise about a made-in claim is that it places the emphasis squarely on the production of the food. This means a food can be made in a country using ingredients exclusively from that country, wholly imported ingredients, or a mixture of both. Under the standard, a food is made in a country if it underwent its last substantial transformation in that country. The definition of substantial transformation is in the Australian Consumer Law. The ACL says a food is substantially transformed in a country if, 1, it was grown or produced in that country, or 2, processing in that country has created a product that is fundamentally different in identity, nature, or essential character from all of its imported ingredients. This means that a food that meets the definition of grown in or produced in could also claim to have been made in that country.
This is actually a really important point. It means that if your food was grown or produced in Australia, it doesn't have to undergo processing to create something fundamentally different in order to make an Australian-made claim. An example of this would be milk. Say you have raw milk from Australian cows that's been pasteurised in Australia. Pasteurising the milk hasn't really created something fundamentally different. However, you could use the Made in Australia kangaroo label because the milk is Australian grown.
That's a really good example, Tanya. The question of whether a food with imported ingredients has been substantially transformed can be trickier. It requires a close assessment of the ingredients that went into the product and how they compare to the final product. For example, let's say you combine Australian ingredients with imported cocoa to manufacture biscuits in Australia. The question you have to ask is whether the chocolate biscuits are fundamentally different in identity, nature, or essential character from the cocoa. I think it's pretty obvious in this case that the biscuits were Australian-made.
Before we go further into this issue about substantial transformation, I just want to quickly note that the fourth and possible final statement that can be made about a food, which is packed in. If a food can't claim to have been grown or produced or made in a single country, then it must be labelled instead with a packed in claim. For example, let's say I import snap frozen mixed vegetables into Australia. The veggies were grown in multiple countries and then sliced, frozen and packed in New Zealand. Now, this product would only be able to claim to have been packed in New Zealand because the vegetables were grown in multiple countries, and slicing and freezing imported vegetables really isn't enough to be able to make a made-in claim. In addition to the packed-in statement, the processor would also have to indicate that the ingredients were from multiple origins.
In terms of tips and traps, I'd recommend you review the standard carefully and also check out the ACCC's Food Labelling Guide for more information about the 4 claims. Doing this may help you to avoid obvious mistakes, like making the wrong claim or not getting the text right on those new labels.
And I'd like to reiterate that the Grown in Australia and Product of Australia kangaroo labels can only be used if you have exclusively Australian content. We've seen businesses get this wrong, so be sure you don't make this mistake as well.
For my part, I'd stress that the test for making a made-in claim has changed and businesses need to consider how it applies to them.
OK, on that note, that's a broad overview of our 4 basic claims.